Weather systems coming in through the rest of this week. It stays windy, and particularly on Thursday, there could be some snow across the north. Another weather front bringing more rain across the northwest on Saturday.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and it's 9:30 rather. This is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Today we'll be talking about mainly Ukraine. Has Russia just invaded? What is the response from the United Kingdom? How should we be reacting and how will our politicians respond? We'll also be talking about the dropping of all of those COVID rules and a new policy for housing. All that and more coming up on the briefing.
A very good morning to you. It is 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. Now, Boris Johnson says that Vladimir Putin appears bent on a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and has completely torn up international law. Following an emergency Cobra meeting this morning, the Prime Minister has vowed to introduce the first barrage of sanctions against Russia. This morning, the Health Secretary Sajid Javid described today as a very dark day for Europe amid reports that Russia has sent tanks across the border. Health leaders, charities and unions have raised concern over Boris Johnson's Living with COVID plan that was unveiled yesterday. Well, the Prime Minister announced that free universal testing for the general public for coronavirus would be scrapped in April. It hasn't been confirmed if that extends to healthcare workers. Well, the NHS Confederation say 94% of health leaders they polled of NHS staff shouldn't pay for tests. Now, in Scotland, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is going to announce her blueprint for managing and recovering from COVID-19 today. When we get details on that, we'll bring it to you here. In terms of the weather, there are more than 100 other flood warnings in place for England, Scotland and Wales. Now, that includes 2 rare severe flood warnings for the West Midlands that's been issued by the Met Office. That means there's a significant danger to life. Experts say more heavy rain today could slow down recovery efforts after 3 storms hit the UK in the past week. A charity is warning most women don't know the key symptoms of ovarian cancer. A poll for Target Ovarian Cancer found the majority of women didn't recognise bloating, abdominal pain and feeling full as warning signs. Deputy Chief Executive of the charity, Alex Holden, is calling on the government for more education. You're now up to date here on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Of course, lots of developing stories today, and I'll keep you across them.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that the first barrage of economic sanctions against Russia will be revealed today. This came after Health Secretary Sajid Javid said that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has already begun. Well, last night, Vladimir Putin officially recognised the eastern Ukrainian areas of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent regions. He had used a similar declaration before in his invasion of Georgia in 2008. Now, Boris Johnson has, of course, warned for weeks that a further incursion into Ukraine will result in far-reaching damage for Russia and the world. Well, independent reports this morning suggest that such an incursion has already begun, with Reuters publishing footage of tanks rolling into the Ukrainian city of Donetsk. Well, let's get more on this now with General Lord Richard Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff of the British Army, who joins me now. Welcome to the programme. It seems that the tanks are rolling in. What on earth should we do more than just economic measures?
Well, Tom, good morning. Yes, you're right. The tanks would appear to be on the move. But I think we just need to be a little bit measured about what tanks are moving where at the present moment. What we've seen over the last few days has been the playing out of a very scripted series of episodes orchestrated by Vladimir Putin. And we saw it come to a first climax, if you like, yesterday when he signed independence agreements for those two disputed republics in the east of Ukraine. And it would appear that he has now moved some troops into those republics. But what we are not seeing are Ukrainian forces fighting against and resisting those Russian troops. And I believe this is because Ukrainians are very keen not to provoke Russia further, and that their own troops have been required not to fire on the Russians. So we are in a difficult moment, there's no doubt about that. Undoubtedly, Russian troops have crossed the Ukrainian border. Again, there's no doubt about that. But is this a full-scale invasion? Well, not yet. And I think we need to be very measured and just watch and wait and see what happens. Yes, of course, the Prime Minister is right to have said that we're going to impose sanctions now because Russian boots have crossed the Ukrainian border. But that, I think, is separate from a full-scale invasion that we still fear, which could involve armoured columns, say, striking from Belarus towards Kiev, striking elsewhere within the country. That's when we'll see, if that happens, the real fighting start. And that's when the West absolutely needs to up its game, both in terms of economic sanctions and massive condemnation of Russia.
Is it wise to draw such a distinction between Russia annexing those two parts of eastern Ukraine and Russia making a full-scale invasion? Aren't both simply against international law, against international norms? And wouldn't a mild package in response to Russia's incursion into those two eastern Ukrainian regions merely encourage him to go further?
Well, you can argue that, and I think that's a very fair point of view. But as I said just now, I think there is still a further line to be crossed, and that is whether the Russians go further into Ukraine. And I'll just make the point again, it would appear that the Ukrainian forces are determined not to provoke Russia further. And what Putin is wanting to see happen is for him to be able to say to the world that the Ukrainians have now launched an offensive against the Russian forces that have gone into those two republics. Because once he can accuse Ukraine of launching an offensive, he then feels he has much more justification to launch a massive counteroffensive. And that is what we're all fearful of. And that could be a massive counteroffensive right into Ukraine. So you're right, the principle has already been briefed.
Interview, Lord Dannatt, we're sort of entering a bit of a phony war here, where Russia may stay where it has moved to and the Ukrainians will sort of not want to touch them. How long can that situation feasibly last?
Well, that's a good question, but I'm afraid you've got to contrast that with Crimea, where exactly the same happened. Russian troops moved in, Ukrainian troops moved out, and the status quo changed. Crimea effectively is Russian. Well, I'm going to have to wait and see what happens to these two republics. Vladimir Putin calls them independent. And of course, it's a tricky old thing. In any border between one country and another, you've got some people who feel more allied to the other country than the one they're living in. And this, of course, is the case in these two republics in the south. There are many Russian-speaking, pro-Russian people that live in those republics.
Yes.
It's not right by any manner of means what the Russians have done, but it's a very clever fudging of the issue. But as I said before, the major Rubicon to be crossed is whether proper armoured divisions, armoured columns, start to smash their way into Ukraine. That's when we'll see the Ukrainians fighting. And that's when we ought to launch our major barrage of economic sanctions and begin the absolutely turned up full volume condemnation of Putin as a villain of the first water in the 21st century. What
it's
he's doing
a fascinating distinction you draw there, Lord Dannett. I'm afraid we've run out of time in this conversation, but thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Let's move on now to Bob Seeley, the Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Bob, just taking that distinction further, should we draw a line between Russian troops incurring upon those regions they have declared to be independent and the rest of Ukraine?
Absolutely, and Lord Dannett is correct. I would be very, very careful, Tom, before we oversell what's happened. It's pretty serious. There's no question about that. But de jure, it is an invasion. But de facto, it's not an invasion because Russia annexed these territories in 2014. And can I just say, when people say they're separate republics, they're not. The commanders there are Russian soldiers. A lot of the troops, a lot of the paramilitaries are Russian soldiers, minus the insignia. All the jobs were appointed by the Kremlin. Yeah, the Russians annexed this territory, and it is annexed by Russia in all but name since 2014. And so to say they're both independent is wrong, and to say that Russia is now invading Ukrainian territory, whilst technically accurate, is not actually the case. And there is one potential option, which is actually potentially quite good news for the West, is that Putin takes his gains in eastern Ukraine because he knows he can't use them to try to undermine the rest of the country and effectively annexes them. And if he does that, he's sort of giving up on potentially invading the rest of Ukraine. That's one option. May not be true, or may not be what happens. But I just think one needs to be very wary before calling this an invasion.
Is there not a distinction that can be made, though, between the area that Putin last night declared independent and the area that the separatists actually control? It's my understanding that the area that Putin recognised is actually quite a bit larger than that the Russian-backed forces, the Russian forces without insignia, whatever we want to call them, have actually controlled since 2014.
Tom, that's a good point. But if you go back to his essay this summer, The Historical Unity of the Russians and the Ukrainian People, actually quite an important essay to read, quite sort of conspiratorial and all that sort of very negative things, he actually lays out a lot of territory that he considers to be Russian or that he doesn't consider to be belonging to Ukraine. He says if Ukraine wants independence, fair enough, but they go back to 1922 Soviet Union founding treaty and they go back to their borders then. And that means no Black Sea coast and no eastern Ukraine. So effectively what he wants to see, and Russian TV at the time laid out all the maps, is all the counties from Odessa, Kherson, Dnipro, on the south of Ukraine. He wants them, and he wants Donetsk, he wants Lugansk, he wants Kharkiv in the east as well. So he effectively wants about half Ukraine's territory, leaving Ukraine as a sort of rump state with not even Kiev, but with western central inland Ukraine. That's ultimately the plan, because that's what he said in his essay.
Well, it's fascinating. We're going to have to I'm afraid we have to leave this conversation here, but no doubt we will be discussing this in further detail down the line, and we'll see if Putin does stay to those areas that he has declared independent. For now, Bob Seeley, thank you very much for joining us, MP and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, of course. But now to the domestic implications of this war. They could be significant. Markets around the world may tumble, affecting pension funds and choking economic recovery. Russian supplies around 40% of Europe's gas. Energy bills, therefore, may rise further still. And Ukraine is a big exporter of grain. Potentially, prices of staple foodstuffs from bread to beer to livestock feed could be affected. So let's turn now to our domestic politics. What is the Prime Minister thinking? Joining me now is John Rentoul, Chief Political Commentator at The Independent. Welcome to the programme, John. The Prime Minister is expected to make a statement around lunchtime to the House of Commons. What's he going to say?
Well, he's already been on television saying that this is extremely serious, slightly glossing over the question of whether this is the tripwire that should trigger full economic sanctions against Russia, although he said that there is going to be a package of economic sanctions with more to come. So we are in the process of imposing economic sanctions. But I think you put your finger on it there, just Tom, when you pointed out that Europe imports 40% of its natural gas from Russia. Now, are we going to cut ourselves off from that at a time when energy prices are already through the roof? Because that would impose huge economic costs on us.
Is the worry there, then, that the West, and particularly continental European powers that import more of their gas from Russia than we do, is the worry that they will basically go down a line of appeasement? And to what extent can the UK influence them to not do that?
Well, exactly the point. And you know, it's fashionable for some British politicians to accuse the Germans, if not by name, of appeasement. I mean, Ben Wallace used that rather sort of redolent phrase, the whiff of Munich, the other day. But it's not as if we, the UK, can cut ourselves off from the international natural gas market. I mean, if we argue for supplies to be stopped from Russia, then we will have to pay higher prices for our gas as well, because it's an international market. So we're not insulated from the consequences of those actions. The question is, are we prepared as a country and as a continent to take them? And it would be interesting to see what the Prime Minister has to say about that at lunchtime.
Yes, and in that lengthy Cobra meeting this morning, chaired, of course, by the Prime Minister, 10 cabinet ministers present, do we have any idea of what the different arguments from different ministers will have been in that meeting? The economic versus the international diplomacy versus the military?
Well, we can guess what some of those arguments would be. Because this is an extremely difficult situation. And although Vladimir Putin did appear to be mildly deranged in his speech yesterday, he is pushing at a weakness in the West, that we cannot decide where the red line is and what the consequences for stepping across it are. So if President Putin continues to salami slice bits of Ukraine, he's testing whether we will resist at some point. And that is the question. And that's the question the Prime Minister really needs to address when he speaks to the Commons today.
Well, we look forward to that statement, expected around lunchtime. We'll bring it live, of course, on GB News. But for now, John Rentoul, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really seismic day this morning. Another seismic thing that happened last night. Yesterday afternoon, even, Boris Johnson announced that all legal self-isolation measures in England will end this Thursday, with free mass testing axed on the 1st of April. This, of course, is part of the Prime Minister's Living with COVID plan. Well, let's speak now to Christopher Snowdon, Head of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, who listened to the statement yesterday afternoon by the Prime Minister. This has been a long time coming, but not everyone in the country is particularly at ease with it.
No, I think that's been the case with every relaxation of restrictions we've had over the course of the last year or so. There are always people kicking and screaming about these things, and it becomes a bit like the boy who cried wolf. You know, the British Medical Association have been saying essentially exactly the same thing from last July when we had Freedom Day. They said we shouldn't do it, to January when the government dropped the Plan B restrictions, and now again with this. The only question is there actually going to be a wolf arriving, as happens, of course, in the story? We don't know, but I think you know, although you can accept, as Chris Whitty did yesterday, that there will be new variants, You can't assume that they're going to be worse. They may, of course, well be less severe. But the point, I think, is that you cannot live on a permanent war footing expecting the very worst to happen. We can spring things back into action if we need to. But I think the days of spending £2 billion a month on free testing do need to be over. I don't think it's the best use of money in the healthcare system.
This seemed to be the big sticking point yesterday, particularly from opposition politicians, perhaps those who didn't want to sound as if they wanted to limit the liberties of the people of this country, arguing for continued mass taxpayer funding of tests. I suppose, in a funny way, that does limit the liberties of the people of the UK, because ultimately we'll have to pay for it all.
Yes, but I mean, we're paying for it anyway. I mean, there's a good argument for saying it would be more efficient if people bought their own tests. I mean, £2 billion is a figure that Boris Johnson gave for January. Actually, in December, it was £2.8 billion. This is just on testing. A lot of people, including myself, find it hard to imagine how quite so much money is spent on this. But the tests are fairly pricey, particularly the PCR tests. And it's not just handing out tests, of course. You've got to have buildings for the people who are handing them out to be based from. You've got vans all around the country, people handing out free lateral flow tests in market squares. They're being posted out to people every day. So you have a huge infrastructure here, and it is very expensive. And it's been quite entertaining, really, watching people who've been developing what's basically a conspiracy theory about test and trace over the last 18 months. And saying that it's a £37 billion white elephant, all the money's gone to Dido Harding, it's all corrupt and what have you, and it hasn't worked. They're now saying we need to do more of it. You know, they're saying, where's the money gone? Well, the reality is that £37 billion hasn't quite gone, but it will have gone at the current rates in only 2 or 3 months' time, because this is an extremely expensive operation. And so, no, it hasn't failed. Most of the test and trace has been going on testing. The vast majority has been going on testing. But in January, we carried out 46 million tests. And they're just the ones that are recorded. And you can be quite sure that there's a huge number of lateral flow tests that were never registered with the government, huge number of lateral flow tests that are stuck in people's cupboards.
Absolutely, it is extraordinary. You're quite right to draw up that comparison. The same group of people complaining about the extraordinary cost of the testing infrastructure are now complaining that that infrastructure is being wound down. Well, I suppose we'll only have to wait and see if this, there is a big case rise to see if this was the right or the wrong decision. I hasten to say that my opinion is that the large groups of people who are now saying this is a bad decision might well claim that they never said that in a few months' time. We'll have to see. But for now, Christopher Snowdon, thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing to discuss that important story. Now, our final issue of the day. A groundbreaking new housing policy paper was published yesterday, one that seemingly won the approval of Housing Secretary Michael Gove, who retweeted the paper twice. Create Mews, as it's called, proposes giving local blocks the powers to replace dilapidated alleyways with new mews. Delivering these attractive, walkable brownfield developments could provide hundreds of thousands of homes and go some way to solving the housing crisis. Now, here's an example of a rundown backstreet in the paper and what it could be transformed to. If you're listening on the radio, do look out for this on social media, on GB News social media, because these backstreets can be turned into attractive housing. There's just a little example of what this paper sets out to do. Well, let's talk now to Nicholas Boys-Smith, the founding director of Create Streets, the organisation behind the paper. Welcome to the programme.
Good morning.
First of all, this looks like an eminently sensible thing to do. Why isn't it currently the case already?
Well, we have a very strange, we have a very strange planning system in this country, which instead of setting out clear rules about what can or can't be done, requires a case-by-case discretionary approach. So every decision is treated as if it's a major planning application, even if it's just quite a minor addition to a house or a new build in this type of back alley. The consequence of that is that the risk, the upfront cost, makes this a difficult thing to do, and we're left with also a specific, almost a sort of dilemma that one single house owner proposing to do this is going to increase the value of his property, but may decrease the value of surrounding properties if they're not all doing it together. So we get to this classic dilemma where what's good for one is not good for all. So what we're trying to do here is, by setting a clearer rules and a clearer process, is allowing all of a neighbourhood, all of a block, all of a street to band together and collectively increase the number of homes and increase the value of their properties.
I really enjoyed one of the analogies in the paper, which was speaking about those landowners who owned huge parts of cities like London in the sort of Victorian era or before, and they'd create areas like Pimlico, like Mayfair, and it would all look sort of uniform and the same. And that's something you can do if you own sort of a huge area like that, but that's not so possible now. So it's sort of democratising that process.
It's very good to pick up on that point. I mean, we're not suggesting going back to the great estates, but their ability to create what I always refer to as variety within a pattern, clearly worked, because 200, 300, 400 years on, those bits of London are still some of the most popular, still some of the most valuable, still some of the most admired, even after 200 years of change. So what we're trying to do is to allow individual groups of people to band together in a way by, what's good for one is good for all.
Now, what do you say to the people who say that we've simply got enough houses in the UK, that sort of say that the housing crisis is a bit of a figment of people's imagination?
It's hard to know where to start with that one. It's just provably false. If you look at the ratio of households to homes, even without taking account of probably suppressed household formation over the last 20 or 30 years. We're several million homes short of where we should be. I'm sure all your viewers know the data on housing affordability. We're chronically undermining the income and the standard of living of anyone basically under the age of 35, and that can't go on. There are some tricks around the corner which perhaps undermine that point. So clearly we do have an unequal economy with the South East driving much of our economic growth. If we are able to level up, it would be possible to slightly undermine that. But the key point is that we've got existing urban infrastructure, towns, cities, neighbourhoods, lots of interwar housing, which is actually quite unintensively used. And if we were able
and your organisation is trying to create what you call gentle density. So not big tower blocks, but not very non-dense, sparsely populated areas. How do you define gentle density?
Anywhere between about 30 or 40 homes per hectare up to about 250, 300 homes per hectare. So Wandsworth through to Earl's Court, to put it in London terms. And the reason we make that case is, there are advantages to personal space. Most of us want access to private garden or to have a flat or home that's big enough. Those are good things for us. There are also advantages to propinquity. The ability to live more sustainably, to combine taking your kids to school or going to the office with meeting friends for a cup of coffee. Also, cities have agglomeration effects. We tend to be more productive, to earn more money, to give more back to the economy when we live in urban cores. However, if we're forced to live, other than if we want to, in a tiny flat up on the 55th floor, down the end of a double-fronted white corridor, we tend to know fewer of our neighbours, to be less happy and to interact less with the town and city around us. So this is a way of trying to have our cake and eat it by allowing gentle intensification, which used to happen. That's how our cities evolved. But we basically turned that off about 70 years ago when we created the current planning system.
Well, having our cake and eating it, it's the policy prize that everyone aspires to. Good luck with pushing this through. It seems like the Housing Secretary might well approve of this idea. But for now, Nicholas Boys-Smith, Founding Director of Create Streets, thank you for joining us on The Briefing. That's it for the programme, I'm afraid. Coming up, it's To the Point with Patrick Christys and Mercy Maroki. But first, here's the weather.
Good morning. Calmer today, but far from calm. Staying pretty windy, in fact, for the rest of this week, just not quite so stormy. We are going to see some further spells of wet weather sinking south, like today, for example. We've got this weather front driving its way in, already bringing some fairly heavy rain to parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland, continuing to track southwards into Northern England and Wales. So quite a wet start in this zone either side.